Welcome to the History Den YouTube channel. This is the 12th video in the Ancient Greek series and the 4th video on the Greco Persian Wars. So in the last video we talked about the Battle of Salamis and how that was the major turning point in the Greco Persian Wars. In this video we will discuss the events leading up to and including the Battle of Plataea, which was another defining moment in the Greco Persian Wars. So before we get to the actual Battle of Plataea, let's talk about what's going on just after the Battle of Salamis. Now, after the battle, the bulk of the Persian fleet departed for the coasts of Asia Minor. And you have to remember this was a battered fleet now. They had nowhere near the capabilities they had before the Battle of Salamis. But a large portion of the land army was ordered to remain in Greece. Thus, the war shifted back to land. The Persian occupying force was commanded by General Mardonius, as Xerxes returned to administration in Asia Minor. Mardonius was a cousin of Xerxes and had quite a lot of military experience. He was allowed to pick many of the best Persian warriors to remain in Greece, so this would not be an easy army to defeat. The army that was left behind numbered around 120,000, and they parked themselves in northern and central Greece. Despite its formidable size, it was now crippled with no real naval support, since most of the battered navy had fled to Asia Minor. This meant that the Persians could never hope to launch an attack against the isthmus, as Themistocles had predicted during the Battle of Salamis. This remaining force of Persians would be expected to hold the line and defend all their previous land grabs in Greece. The defensive arrangement must have been unusual to the Persian commanders who were used to constantly advancing, not defending. However, the Persians did have one advantage. Thessaly, Macedonia, and Thrace all remained loyal to Persia, even after Salamis. So really, the Greek allies only have control of Attica and the Peloponnesus. But of course, those are the two dominant players in Greece, in Athens and Sparta. So for a while, there's almost this unusual standstill that occurs where there's not a lot of action. It's almost as if a Cold War starts between the areas controlled by the Persians in Greece and the areas controlled by the Greek allies. Okay, as we mentioned before, the Persians vacated Attica, and that allowed the Athenians to reclaim Athens. The Athenians began the difficult task of repairing and fixing much of the damage that had been done by the Persians. Even with Mardonius camped in Thessaly, the allied Greeks seemed content to ignore the Persians for a while. Instead, the Greeks waged a propaganda war against each other. Each side claimed responsibility for the victory at Salamis. Themistocles, of course the great hero of Salamis, began to lose political leverage in Athens to the conservative agrarian farmers and nobles. They demanded a return to the glory days of Marathon and a return to a land-based Athenian army. And of course they felt that Salamis, as it was a navy victory, had stolen much of their thunder. It also did not help that the Spartans decided to honor Themistocles, along with Eurybiades as the hero of Salamis. For his contributions to the war effort, they actually gave Themistocles the finest chariot in Sparta. This was highly unusual in that non-Spartans rarely were given such rewards. A different fate awaited, though, when Themistocles returned to Athens. In early 479, he was not even elected as an archon. This really marks the end of Themistocles' involvement in the wars with Persia. Aristides took control of the Athenian land army, and Xanthippus took control of Themistocles' beloved navy. So with Themistocles out of the way, relations between Athens and Sparta began to show signs of strain. Athens wanted to take a land fight to Mardonius and drive the rest of the Persians out of Thessaly and Greece. The Spartans were more inclined, as always, to remain south of the isthmus, since there was no chance of a Persian attack there. Isolationism, after all, was always Sparta's preferred foreign policy. Wisely, Mardonius decided to take advantage of the split and sent envoys to Athens. He proposed a new alliance against Sparta. He also promised to rebuild Athens and give vast amounts of money to the city's coffers. The Athenians, however, found it difficult to believe anything the Persians said, and they rejected the proposal out of hand. They also made sure that the Spartans were very aware of this rejection. The rejection of the Persians' latest offer also meant another Persian invasion of Attica. The Athenians could only hope the Spartan army would come to their aid. Upon hearing the Athenian rejection of his proposals, Mardonius broke camp and marched his army towards Attica. Although he had the full support from Thessaly and Macedonia, the Thebans and Boeotians were less sure about another invasion. The Thebans especially seemed more willing to keep the peace rather than risk another all-out war. Nonetheless, Mardonius continued into Attica and he reasoned that perhaps the threat of force would induce the Athenians to his cause. Unfortunately for the Athenians, the Spartan army failed to appear, so Athens was on its own. Athens once again found itself retreating to the safety of Salamis, and Mardonius found Athens completely abandoned. As Herodotus related, there was no Athenians to be found, for all of them were either with the fleet or at Salamis. Athens mobilized their entire fleet for added protection, but without the Spartans they had little hope of attacking the Persians on land, and the Persians for their part had little hope of attacking Salamis without their navy at hand. Athenian envoys were dispatched to the Peloponnesus to find out what on earth Sparta was going to do. In the meantime, Mardonius decided to offer the same terms as before to Athens. Given the dire straits Athens was in, there was a slight possibility they might just accept. For the Athenians, this was a golden opportunity. They could play the Persians off the reluctant Spartans and get them to commit to the war again. And for the Spartans, the idea that Athens could actually form an unthinkable alliance with the Persians pushed them over the edge. Sparta finally agreed to ally with Athens for one last time to destroy the Persian field army in Greece. Whether or not the Athenians ever took the Persian offer seriously is unknown, but it was a bluff the Spartans could not afford to call. In fact, when the Athenian emissaries delivered an ultimatum to the Spartans the next day, they were amazed to hear that a task force was in fact already en route, and the Spartan army was marching to meet the Persians. The allied Greek army consisted of 80,000 soldiers, and as I said, they were marching towards Plataea. Now let's take a look at the composition of the army. There were 5,000 Spartans, 35,000 lightly armed Helots. Now the Spartans probably forced the Helots to go because there was no way the Spartans were going to allow the Helots to stay behind because they might start a revolt. There were also 5,000 Periokoi, and Athens provided 8,000 hoplites to the allied army. And there were numerous other Greek contingents. In fact, along the way, they picked up various other hoplites from the other Greek cities. This would be one of the first battles in the war in which the Greeks were not severely outnumbered, and that was bad news for the Persians. Not surprisingly, the allied Greeks were under the command of a Spartan general, and his name was Pausanias. Pausanias was the nephew of Leonidas. He had been appointed regent after Leonidas' death at Thermopylae. Pausanias made the entire Greek allied army take an oath of loyalty to the cause. Now, when Mardonius received the news that the Greek allied army was on the move, he made immediate plans to get out of Attica. He had no intention of facing the might of the Spartans in Attica, where the rocky terrain worked against his vaunted cavalry. Still, he didn't want to leave Attica without leaving his mark. Athens was burned down yet again, and a scorched earth policy was employed against the entire countryside. This had the added benefit of preventing the allies from foraging for their supplies. The Persians then retreated toward Thebes. Here Mardonius created a strongly fortified encampment on the northern bank of the Aesopus River. It was here that he waited for the Greeks. He also hoped to lure the Greek army into territory that would be suitable for the Persian cavalry. That is, the surrounding plains that he was encamped on. The Persians also cleared all the surrounding timber and set up a large stockade at their encampment. The nearest town was called Plataea, which of course gave the name to the famous battle. The main road from this area led to Thebes. The Persians had the added benefit of still being on friendly terms with the Thebans. With the river and fort for defense, this army would be hard-pressed for the Greek army to launch any surprise attack against it. The Greeks finally appeared descending the slopes of the mountain overlooking the plain and the river. Seeing the defenses that the Persians set up, the Greeks decided to set up camp across the river from Mardonius. Pausanias, like the Persians, set up a defensive position with the Helots protecting his rear. With their backs to the mountains, the Greeks also protected all the passes to prevent Mardonius from cutting off their lines of communications. Now, Pausanias had no intention of advancing any further into the plains, where the Persian cavalry could cut his forces down. It was far more practical to hang around in the rocky ground at the base of the mountain, which gave his forces added protection from the Persian cavalry. The two armies would camp at their respective positions for 8 long days, and just sat there staring at each other. And this reminds me a little bit of the situation at Marathon, when both armies were just waiting around for something to happen. Each general saw the danger of assaulting well-established defensive lines. And as always, both sides consulted their priests and seers to keep their armies in line. As it was always the case in ancient times, if you wanted your army to do something, you presented them with an omen to get them to move or to stay put. Mardonius finally broke the stalemate by sending his vaunted cavalry against the Athenian contingent. This was essentially just a raid, not an all-out assault, but it was designed to lure the Greeks out into the open plain. It failed, and in the process, the Persians lost their greatest cavalry commander. The loss was a tremendous blow to the Persians, but the strategy worked partially at least, because the Greek army morale was boosted by this small victory, and thus the Greeks moved forward. Though still remaining on the high ground, they took a new position that was closer to Mardonius' camp. So the Spartans took up the position on the right flank, the Athenians had the left flank, and everybody else was in the center. The entire formation probably took up around 3 miles, if you can imagine that. Mardonius drew up his battle line formations in a similar manner. Pausanias was absolutely determined to keep his forces positioned south of the river. He did not want to give the Persians any tactical advantage. Mardonius could not linger as his supplies were dwindling, and he could not receive any supplies from the remnants of the Persian fleet, so if he wasn't going to get any supplies, he was going to make sure the Greeks didn't have any either. So he ordered the Persian cavalry to cut off some of the vital mountain passes on the Greek flanks that were supplying the allies. The operation was successful, but still Pausanias refused to order his army forward, even though his supply lines had been compromised. Amazingly, 3 more days passed as this deadlock continued, as each side still refused to budge. Herodotus claims this is because both sides received bad omens during sacrificial rituals. So eventually Mardonius redeployed his troops. He redeployed his cavalry and best troops to assault the Spartans, knowing that that fight alone would decide the fate of the war. Still, the odds were not good as the Spartans occupied the high ground, which Pausanias astutely refused to give up. Even more ominous for the Persians, it would be a phalanx-favored frontal assault. But if the Persians could somehow get the Spartans off that ridge, the rest of the Greek army would surely fold. Then came a bit of luck for the Persians. The Persian cavalry cut off the only spring supplying the Greek army with its vital water supply. Since this was the only source of water for the Greek army, the situation now became dire. The Greeks had no option now but to retreat, but they had to wait until the cover of darkness. The reason they were retreating at night was to prevent that Persian cavalry that had just attacked the spring from attacking them. However, the retreat went totally awry. The Allied contingents in the center missed their appointed position and ended up scattered in front of Plataea itself. The Athenians, Tegeans, and Spartans, who had been guarding the rear of the retreat, had not even begun to retreat by daybreak. Thus, a single Spartan division was left on the ridge to guard the rear, while the rest of the Spartans and Tegeans retreated uphill. Pausanias also instructed the Athenians to begin the retreat and, if possible, join up with the Spartans. However, the Athenians at first retreated directly towards Plataea, and thus the Allied battle line remained fragmented as the Persian camp began to stir. The next morning, Mardonius noticed the Greek positions had been abandoned. Because the retreat had been so poorly executed, it gave the illusion of a panicked retreat. Assuming the Greeks were in full flight, Mardonius ordered his entire army across the river in hot pursuit. As I mentioned, though, in reality, the Greeks were just retreating back to their original positions to secure the supply lines. The Persian cavalry was ordered to attack the Spartans first, while the Persian center remained still. The Spartans requested immediate help from the Athenians, but they were under assault from the Theban troops. So with this, the Spartans simply turned their formation around to meet the Persian cavalry head-on, and this fight would decide the entire battle. The Spartans had no cavalry, so it would be up to their heavy infantry to withstand the initial onslaught without any help. Now, in ancient times, infantry rarely withstood a cavalry charge, but these were the Spartans after all, and despite taking losses initially, the Spartan cohesion remained unbroken, and they put up a fierce resistance. After a long and desperate, savage fight, the Spartans overcame the Persian cavalry, and the Persian horse units were forced to retreat. The Tegeans and Spartans then advanced against the Persian infantry in the center and on the right flank. The Persians placed most of their heavily armored units in the front ranks, but they were again no match for the elite Spartan hoplites. After intense resistance, the Spartans were able to drive a wedge through the Persian ranks. Many of the Greek hoplites were forced to switch to swords, as the Persians attempted to neutralize the long hoplite spears. Mardonius was present at the scene, riding in this glimmering white horse, and surrounded by a bodyguard of about 1,000 men. While he remained, the Persians stood their ground. However, the Spartans closed in on Mardonius and succeeded in killing him. With Mardonius dead, the Persians began to flee in mass. His bodyguard, however, remained, and they were killed almost to the man. Eventually, the entire length of the Persian line was thrown into complete disarray after learning of the left flank collapse. And with the loss of Mardonius, the Greek victory was a formality. The Athenian left flank was also able to defeat the Persian Greek allies, and now a general rout was in order. The Spartans drove Mardonius's wing across the Aesopus River. The Spartans and Athenians killed almost every retreating Persian they could, to the man. The Persians lost well over 100,000 soldiers. The Greek losses were just a few thousand. The remaining Persians, perhaps 10,000, entered their well-built stockade and blocked the main gates. The Greeks were initially unable to dislodge the Persians out of their fort, but finally the siege-versed Athenians broke down the gateway, and with that the gates were stormed and no quarter was given to the defenders. Almost every Persian was slaughtered, and with that the Persian land army in Greece ceased to exist. This really was the final major battle in the Greco Persian Wars. Now, the conduct of Persia's Greek allies during the Battle of Plataea has been called into question. Their discipline was uninspired, but they likely were less motivated in assisting the Persians against their fellow Greeks. Many of the allied Greek-Persian units simply retreated off the battlefield after a Greek victory became a certainty. Now, the Greek allies had a debate on whether to march on Thebes and punish the Thebans for their cooperation with the Persians. But Thebes was a massive city in its own right, with elaborate walls and large defensive structures. The weary Greeks now were in no mood to start another war, and so they withdrew from Plataea. In any event, it mattered little now as the main war was over. And with that, the Persians were pretty much expelled out of mainland Greece. And now the allied Greeks could look outside of mainland Greece and towards Persia itself. But we will get to that in the next video.